Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. I want to start with a thought experiment, and it's not a pleasant one, but stay with me because everything in the next 40 or so minutes really kind of hangs on it. Imagine a government deciding that the quickest way to destroy a culture wasn't to kill the adults, but to remove every child. Think about the cold logic of it. Adults are difficult to change. They have memories, languages, loyalties, songs. But a child? A child is still becoming. Take the children young enough, keep them long enough, forbid them their language, their clothes, their names, and their parents, and in a single generation, culture simply stops. No massacre required, no war, just wagons and trains and a lot of paperwork. Now stop imagining, because this isn't a thought experiment. It's policy. Written down, budgeted, debated in Parliament, administered by civil servants, staffed by churches, and run, well, in one of the world's most admired democracies for more than 100 years. This is the story of Canada's residential schools, and it's one of the darkest stories I've ever told on my podcast series. But I promise you, it's not the end. A story about despair. It's a story about children and the astonishing, stubborn, quiet ways that children can actually refuse. Let's begin. Every terrible system begins as an idea that sounded reasonable to somebody. So let's go back and watch this one actually being born. It's the 1870s. Canada is a brand new country. Confederation happened in 1867, and it's expanding westward fast across lands where First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples have lived for literally thousands of years. The new government signs treaties, moves people into reserves, and passes a sweeping piece of legislation called the Indian Act, which puts nearly every aspect of Indigenous life under government control. What Indigenous people can own, where they can live, even eventually whether they can hire a lawyer to complain about any of it. But look, land is only half the project. The other half is people. And in 1879, the government commissions a journalist and a politician named Nicholas Flood Davin to go south and study something the Americans have been experimenting with: industrial boarding schools for Native children. Davin visits, takes notes, and comes home with a report. And the report's core recommendation rests on one chilling observation. Day schools don't work, Davin says, because every evening the children go home to their parents, home to their language, home to what he calls the influence of the wigwam. The solution, he argues, is to take the children away from their families altogether. Boarding schools, far from the reserve, where the so-called influence can actually be broken. But think about what I've just said, because it's the whole system in one sentence. The schools were designed around the removal of children from their parents. That wasn't a side effect. That was actually the entire point. The American model Davin admired had its own slogan, courtesy of an Army officer named Richard Pratt, who founded the famous Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. Pratt summarized his mission in words that still stop my blood. What he said was, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." In Canada, a version of the same idea, "Kill the Indian in the child," became the phrase that history remembers. Historians still debate exactly who first said the Canadian version and when, but nobody debates that it captures the mindset. The child was seen as a container holding something that the state wanted removed. And no figure embodies that mindset more completely than Duncan Campbell Scott, the civil servant who ran Indian affairs for decades. Scott is a strange, uncomfortable figure in Canadian history. He's a celebrated poet, a cultured man of letters, who actually declared in plain administrative language that the goal of his department was to continue until there was not a single Indigenous person in Canada who hadn't been absorbed into the body politic. His phrase, to absorb them until there was, as he put it, no Indian question left. In 1920, under Scott, attendance became compulsory. The law backed by police and truant officers now required Indigenous parents to hand over their children. So there's the idea, fully assembled by the earlier 20th century. Identify every Indigenous child in the country, remove them from their families, and remake them. Churches would run the schools, Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, Methodist, and later the United Church, because churches were cheap, they were motivated, and already in the missionary conversion business. The government would set policy and pay the bills, and as we'll see, very badly. So how did the machine work? Well, let me give you the scale of what was built, because the numbers actually matter. Between the 1880s and the late 20th century, this system operated across almost the entire country. Well over 100 federally supported schools from British Columbia to the Maritimes to the Arctic. More than 150,000 First Nations children passed through them. 150,000 children. Hold on to that number. That's not a policy footnote, that's generational. By the middle of the 20th century, it was entirely normal for an Indigenous family to have a grandmother, a father, and a child who had all been through those schools. 3 generations, each taken in turn. Some of those children were 4 or 5 years old. Many were taken literally hundreds of miles from home, deliberately, Remember, because distance was the actual design. In some regions, children were collected by wagon. In others, they were flown or shipped out of remote communities at the end of summer, and their parents simply wouldn't see them again until the following year. If then. Some children were taken by police. And that's not rhetoric, that's how the law worked. After 1920, a parent who refused to surrender their child could be fined or jailed. Survivors describe the annual arrival of the Indian agent or the priest or the Mountie at the end of August. Communities came to dread the harvest season for reasons that had nothing to do with the weather. And I want to pause on the parents for a moment because they can get lost in this story. Imagine being a mother in, say, northern Saskatchewan in 1935. You know what the school is. You may have actually been there yourself, and you carry your own memories of it. And the law of your country says that if you hide your child, you can be prosecuted, and the child will be taken away anyway. Some parents actually camped outside the schools just to be near their children. Some moved whole families deep into the bush, off the map, to keep the wagons from finding them. Most had no options at all. Powerlessness was built into the system as deliberately as the dormitories were. I went to a boarding school, and one of the things that I remember from that experience is always the first day. So I want to think about the first day of these children. And I want to shrink this story down from 150,000 children to 1, because a number that size numbs the mind. And this story shouldn't be numbing. So imagine a 6-year-old, a boy, let's say, though it could just as easily be a girl. It's September. A wagon arrives at the reserve, or a truck, or a boat, depending on the decade. His mother is crying and trying not to because she doesn't want his last night, his last sight of her, to be tears. His father stands very still in the particular stillness of a man who can do absolutely nothing. The boy doesn't really understand where he's going. Nobody has asked him anything. The journey itself takes a day or 2 or 5, and then the doors, and then the procedure. Because it is a procedure repeated tens of thousands of times, and survivors describe it so consistently that I can actually reconstruct it almost hour by hour. The first thing that happens is that his hair is cut immediately, usually within the first hours of arriving. In many Indigenous cultures, hair is deeply significant. Braids actually carry meaning. And in some traditions, hair is cut only in mourning. And the children know this. The staff mostly didn't, or they didn't care. So for many children, the very first thing the school did was, in the language of their own culture, mark them as bereaved, which in a way they actually were. His clothes are taken and replaced with a uniform. He's scrubbed, often with a harsh disinfectant, and then he's given a number, and he's given a new name, an English or a French name, because his own name is deemed unpronounceable or heathen or simply inconvenient. Some survivors say that for years afterwards, they were called by their numbers as often as by any name at all. Then there's the rules. And the first rule is the one everything else hangs on. Your language is forbidden. From this moment, the only words in his head, the only words for his mother, for home, for hungry, for scared, well, they're all contraband. And here's the detail that breaks me when I read these stories. He looks across the yard and he sees his older sister. And he learns that boys and girls are kept strictly apart. Separate dormitories, separate classrooms, separate everything, actually. Brothers and sisters in the same building, forbidden to speak to each other. Survivors have described going years exchanging only glances with a sibling literally 5 feet across the dining hall. Some actually smuggled scraps of comfort, a wave, a bit of bread, a look. You know, the way a person smuggles letters. No hugging, no family, no grandparents, no ceremonies, no songs, no stories at bedtime. Bedtime is now a bell, a prayer in a language he doesn't understand, and then the lights are out. And then in the dark, the sound that survivor after survivor from different schools, different provinces, different decades describe in almost identical words. The sound of dozens of children crying themselves to sleep. A dormitory of little kids, each one certain they mustn't be heard, all hearing each other. And that was the first day. And there would be, for many children, 3,000 more. Daily life in the schools would have varied. Some were less brutal than others. Some staff were kind. And it matters that I say that because the system as a whole ran on 2 engines, discipline and scarcity. Speaking Cree or any of the other dozen languages the children brought with them, well, that was actually punishable. Survivors describe strappings, humiliations, and a detail so common it actually appears in testimony across the entire country. Having their mouths washed out with soap for speaking their own language. Think about what that teaches a small child. The words your mother gave you are dirty. Some children actually stopped speaking almost entirely for years at a time, caught between a forbidden language and one they didn't yet have. And then there would be the hunger. The schools were funded per child at rates that were low even by the standards of the day, and the churches ran them on those starvation budgets, sometimes topping up the difference with the children's own labor, which I'll come to. Food was thin, it was poor, and it was monotonous. Survivors talk about hunger not as an event, but actually as a condition, the constant background hum of childhood. Some describe stealing from the school's own barns full of food the children themselves had farmed, destined for sale or for the staff table, and being beaten for it later. Decades later, researchers even documented that nutritional experiments had been conducted on malnourished children at some of the schools in the 1940s, studying effectively hungry children rather than simply feeding them. In those crowded, underfunded, poorly ventilated buildings came the diseases of the age. Tuberculosis above all, plus influenza, plus measles, and of course pneumonia. And they tore through those dormitories. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries especially, the death rates in some schools were absolutely staggering. the kind of mortality you associate with epidemics and disasters, certainly not with education. And here's where I want to introduce you to one of the few genuinely honorable figures in the administrative side of this story. His name was Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, and he was the Chief Medical Officer for the Department of Indian Affairs. In 1907, Bryce inspected schools across the prairies and wrote up what he found. His report was devastating. In the schools he examined, roughly 1 in 4 children had died, either at school or shortly after being sent home sick. At one school, counting the children who died after discharge, the figure approached 7 in 10. Bryce laid it out plainly. The schools were killing children, and chiefly through tuberculosis spread by conditions that the government itself had created, and what he then recommended was sweeping medical reforms. And what happened to Dr. Bryce? His report was leaked to the press. There were headlines, there was brief outrage, and then the government neatly buried it. His recommendations were rejected as too expensive. Duncan Campbell Scott's department sidelined him, cut off his funding, and eventually pushed him out of the civil service. Scott himself wrote in an internal memo words that deserve to be read aloud in every Canadian classroom. He acknowledged that Indigenous children die at a much higher rate in the schools than in the villages. But this alone does not justify a change in policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. So Scott knew it. Everybody knew it. It's in the files, in their own handwriting. Bryce, to his lasting credit, refused to keep quiet. In 1922, out of the service and with nothing left to lose, he published everything in a slim pamphlet with an unsparing title, The Story of a National Crime. Sadly, it only sold a few copies, but you can still find them on the internet today. And it did little to change anything at the time, but it sits in the record now, proof that none of this was unknowable because one of their own doctors had told them in writing in 1907. And I think that's the whole point of why he did it. Nobody knows exactly how many children died in the system across its entire history. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, well, I'll get to it, documented more than 3,000 named and unnamed children, and its chair believed the true number was significantly higher. Many records were actually destroyed, and many deaths were simply never recorded. Children were often buried in the school grounds, in school cemeteries, sometimes without their families ever being told where. Hold on to that fact because it becomes very important near the end of this story. So what else happened? There's a part of this story that has to be told carefully, and I'm going to try and tell it as carefully as I can. It's now beyond dispute, established through thousands of sworn testimonies, court proceedings, and of course the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, that in these schools, thousands of children suffered physical abuse, emotional abuse, and of course, sexual abuse. Neglect wasn't the exception, and in many schools and many eras, it was the operating condition. The people responsible were staff, some clergy, some lay, and the institutions they served protected the system far more diligently than they ever protected the children. So I'm going to fill this section with a little bit of detail. The testimony is actually public. It's in the record for anyone who wants to read it, and I would encourage you to do so. But what I want to give you instead is the shape of it. Children far from home, cut off from their parents, taught that authority was absolute. I mean, really the perfect conditions for predators and the worst possible conditions for a child to be believed. Many survivors actually carried what happened in silence for 40 and 50 years. Many never told anyone at all. And some of the deepest damages of this system lie exactly there, in the silence that it actually manufactured. And alongside the abuse, there was the labor. The schools were actually called schools, but for long stretches, many operated on the half-day system. Half a day of lessons, half a day of work. And the work was actually the school. Children actually cooked the meals, they cleaned the buildings, they did the laundry, farmed the fields, they repaired the roofs. Some survivors have said flatly that they weren't educated at these institutions, they basically maintained them. Free child labor keeping the underfunded machine running. Which brings me to the bittersweet irony, I think, of the entire system, the double exile. Because remember, what the schools claimed to offer in exchange for everything they took was an education, a future in Canadian society. That was the bargain. That was the justification. The word school doing all the moral work. But they largely failed to deliver even that. The academic education was, in many schools and many decades, below standard, poor. You had underqualified staff, half days of instruction, and low expectations actually baked in. Most children were being trained for domestic service and farm labor because that's all the system imagined for them. So follow the arithmetic of what a child could lose. Firstly, their language, beaten out or simply eroded until many could no longer speak with their own grandparents. Literally, there are countless accounts of children coming home unable to communicate with the family that love them. Their traditional skills, the hunting, the medicines, the ceremonies, the entire inherited university of their own culture, gone. Because those things are taught by aunties and grandfathers. They're not learned in exile. Their family bonds, strained past breaking by years of separation, by the strangeness, by the things that couldn't be said. And in return, an education that opened very few doors in a society that discriminated against them anyway. Survivors describe it as being caught between the two worlds and at home in neither. The school had made them strangers to their own families and had never intended to make them equals in a Canadian society, a double exile. And then that exile gets passed down. And this is what people mean by intergenerational trauma. And I think it's actually worth being concrete about it. Parenting is learned, mostly by being parented. But if you were raised from the age of 6 by an institution with no bedtime stories, no hugs, no affection, or whatever affection you do get being rationed or absent, discipline delivered as violence, what do you actually expect that child to pass on? You know, thousands of survivors became parents while carrying wounds that nobody had ever helped them name. The school's damage didn't stop at the people who attended them. It echoed into children and grandchildren who never saw the inside of one. When Indigenous communities in Canada talk today about healing, this is the depth of what's being healed. The cultural rupture, in other words, worked very much as designed. And if the story stopped here, it would only be tragedy. But thankfully, it doesn't stop here. Because here's what the architects of this system never put in their calculations. The actual children themselves. The children resisted, not with speeches or petitions. They were little kids, thousands of miles inside a system that controlled every hour of their day. They resisted the way children do, cunningly, quietly, constantly. They kept their language alive in whispers, in the barns doing forced chores out of staff earshot, under blankets after lights out, in the yard, mouths barely moving. Older children taught the younger ones. A phrase here, a song there, and it gives me goosebumps to think about this and to pass this information on. They were literally passing the language along like contraband, which is exactly what it was. Survivors have described realizing as adults that they still had their language because another child had risked a beating to give it to them. They kept the songs. They kept the stories told in fragments at night. They gave each other secret nicknames, their real names, their home names, and they used them out of the staff's hearing. Some kept ceremonies alive in miniature, in stolen moments, improvised from memory. Every one of those acts was punishable. Every one of them happened anyway, in school after school, decade after decade. And of course, they ran. Children slipping away in twos and threes, trying to walk home. Sometimes home was 30 miles away. Sometimes it was 500. They ran anyway, in autumn, in winter, along railway lines and bush trails, because a small child's longing for their mother doesn't do arithmetic. Some made it. Many were caught and brought back to punishment, heads shaved, meals docked, beaten, but they would run again. And some died trying. And let me tell you about one of them, because his story eventually helped wake up an entire country. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Altidomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altidomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. His name was Chani Wenjak. He was Ojibwe, he was 12 years old, and he was from Ogoki Post in northern Ontario. In October 1966, Chani ran away from his residential school near Kenora with 2 other boys. What he apparently didn't fully grasp was how far away home was, about 600 miles. The other boys found relatives along the way. Chani kept going, alone, in very light clothes, in the sleet and cold of a northern Ontario autumn, following the railway tracks, carrying almost nothing but a little glass jar with a few matches in it. He walked for days, and his body was found beside the tracks on the 23rd of October, 1966. Hunger, exposure, 12 years old, dead of trying to go home. And here's why we know his name. His death was one of the very few that broke the national press at the time. Maclean's magazine ran a searing piece, and an inquest was called. And the inquest jury, ordinary citizens in 1966, produced a finding decades ahead of its government. The residential school system itself, they said, in effect, causes tremendous emotional and psychological harm and deserves scrutiny. Half a century later, Chani's story reached a new generation when Gord Downey, frontman of the Tragically Hip, one of the most beloved musicians in Canada, spent the final year of his life turning it into an album and a film called Secret Path, telling audiences that Canada wasn't yet the country it believed itself to be. Now, I said at the start this wasn't a story about despair, and this is why. Culture doesn't survive on its own. It survives because people carry it. And in this story, the carriers were children. Children who whispered their language under blankets. Children who walked into blizzards towards home. The culture that exists today, the languages now being revived, the ceremonies now held openly, exist in a direct, traceable line from those acts of small, enormous courage. The policy assumed children were empty vessels to be refilled. The children turned out to be the strongest part of the entire chain. So let me now tell you about one school in particular, because it stands at the center of this story's final act. The Kamloops Indian Residential School in the interior of British Columbia, on the land of the Kamloops Tissaquaquam people. It opened in 1890, and it was run by the Catholic Church, and it grew into the largest school in the entire system. At its peak, around 500 children at a time, and it operated until 1978. Thousands upon thousands of children passed through its doors. The building is still there, a great draconian brick institution that you could mistake driving past it for an old college. Kamloops matters for another reason too. It became one of the first schools whose survivors put their memories into a book. Through the work that now exists under the title Chakal-Muxwil, the Kamloops Indian Residential School, Resistance and a Reckoning. And I want to dwell on the word in the subtitle, resistance, because what makes this book so valuable, and it grew out of decades of survivors telling their own history on their own terms, is that it refuses to be only a catalogue of suffering. It actually restores the survivors as full human beings. It records the punishments, yes, but also the schemes, the friendships, the smuggled words, the way children looked after each other, the humor, because there was humor, the dark, indestructible humor of people surviving something together. And it treats memory itself as an act of community. And it actually insists on the point I've been making this whole podcast. These children were never passive victims. They were resourceful, they were loyal and defiant, and they found countless ways to remain who they were under pressure specifically engineered to stop them. So keep Kamloops in your mind, because I'm coming back to it. But first I need to tell you when all this ended, because I promise you the answer isn't what you think. Ask most people when the residential schools closed, and they'll guess something around probably the Second World War, maybe the 50s at a stretch. But here's the thing. The last federally run residential school in Canada, the Gordon Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan, closed in 1996. So let me put that year in context for you. Nelson Mandela was president of South Africa. The internet existed. People had email addresses. Dolly the sheep had just been cloned. The Spice Girls were on the radio. And a residential school for Indigenous children was still operating on the Canadian prairie. So this isn't ancient history, folks. There are survivors of this system who were younger than I am. And when I say survivors, I'm not talking about a fading generation in sepia photographs. I'm talking about people in their 30s and 40s and 50s who are actually raising families right now. And here's something else that complicates the tidy idea of an ending. As the schools began winding down through the 1960s and 1970s, the removals didn't stop. They just changed shape. They call it the 60s scoop. As provincial child welfare systems took over from the actual schools, social workers began removing Indigenous children from their families in extraordinary numbers, often on grounds that amounted to poverty or simply an official's judgment that an Indigenous home wasn't a proper home. So tens of thousands of children were actually taken, and this time they weren't sent to institutions. They were adopted out to non-Indigenous families across Canada, into the United States, some as far away as Europe. Many grew up with no idea who they were, no language, no community. In some cases, no knowledge that they were Indigenous at all. Adults who discovered their own identity in middle age from a document, almost like a plot twist in someone else's novel. So, same operation effectively, new paperwork. The wagon became a caseworker's car, and the pattern's shadow reached further still. To this day, Indigenous children remain dramatically overrepresented in Canada's foster care system. A fact Indigenous leaders point to whenever anyone suggests this story belongs safely to the past. The machinery of removal, they argue, was never fully dismantled. It was just renamed. So when did it actually end? 1978 at Kamloops, 1996 at Gordon, and in some respects, that question is still being answered. And the reckoning, when it finally came, was started, as ever in this story, by survivors themselves. In 1990, a First Nations leader named Phil Fontaine did something almost unthinkable at the time. He spoke publicly on national television about the abuse that he had suffered at a residential school. The silence, so carefully manufactured over a century, finally cracked. Others then began to speak. Then thousands. Lawsuits followed, then a royal commission. And in 2006, the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. In 2008, the Prime Minister of Canada stood in the House of Commons and formally apologized to survivors, to their families, and to Indigenous peoples for the government's role in this system. And out of that settlement came something remarkable: the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For 6 years, the commission traveled the country, and nearly 7,000 survivors gave testimony, many speaking about their childhoods aloud for the very first time. And in the 70s and the 80s, sometimes with their own children learning at that moment why their family was actually the way it was. So just for a moment, picture one of those hearings, because the transcripts and recordings are among the most extraordinary documents that Canada possesses. A community hall somewhere on the prairies, rows of folding chairs, a box of tissues on the witness table, always the tissues. An elder in his 80s takes the microphone and begins, sometimes in English, sometimes in the language the school tried to take, and tells a room full of strangers and family what happened to him when he was 6. 60, 70 years of silence, ending in one afternoon. Support workers stood by at every hearing because the telling itself was that emotionally hard. And in the audience, again and again, adult children hearing for the first time why. Why dad never talked about his childhood. Why grandma flinched at church bells. Why the family tree seemed to have a very large piece missing. Whole families reassembled their own histories in those rooms in real time. In 2015, the Commission delivered its findings, 94 calls to action, and its verdict on what the system had been. Its chair, Justice Murray Sinclair, himself Anishinaabe, summed it up in a phrase chosen with the judge's precision: cultural genocide. The deliberate destruction of structures and practices that actually allow a group to continue as a group. That is what the Commission concluded Canada had done. And Sinclair added something else worth remembering. Education, he said, got us into this mess, and education will get us out of it. Which brings me back, as I promised, to the Kamloops. In May 2021, the Kamloops Te Sequapum First Nation announces the results of a survey of the grounds of the old Kamloops school, conducted with ground-penetrating radar, technology that can actually detect disturbances in soil without digging. The survey has identified what appeared to be about 200 probable unmarked graves on the school grounds. Now, precision actually matters here, and I want to be careful in exactly the way this subject deserves. Ground-penetrating radar shows anomalies in the earth consistent with burials. It cannot, by itself, identify who actually lies there or how they died, and the sites haven't all been excavated. The work of confirming and identifying where families want it, repatriating remains, it's slow, it's painstaking, and it's ongoing, and it's being led by the communities themselves. But here's the thing. The existence of children's graves at residential schools was never the revelation. Survivors had said this for decades. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had actually documented missing children and burial sites in an entire volume, years earlier. The children who never came home had names, and the families who had never stopped telling their stories. What changed in 2021 was that Canada, and then the rest of the world, finally heard it. The announcement went around the globe. Flags across Canada came down to half-mast and stayed there for months. Impromptu memorials appeared on the steps of legislatures and churches. Rows of children's shoes, one pair for each suspected grave. Other First Nations began surveys of other school grounds, and more probable burial sites were reported throughout that summer. The following year, Pope Francis traveled to Canada and on Canadian soil apologized for the conduct of Christians in the residential school system. And on his flight home, he used the word genocide himself. And look, everywhere that summer you saw orange. And let me tell you why, because it's one small story that stands for all of it, I think. In 1973, a 6-year-old Secwepemc girl named Phyllis Webstad arrived for her first day at a residential school in British Columbia wearing a brand new orange shirt. Bought by her grandmother, the proudest possession of her small life. On arrival, the staff took it away. She never saw it again. Decades later, she told that story publicly, and the orange shirt became a symbol. It became a symbol of small treasured things that the schools took and of the children that they took it from. Orange Shirt Day, Every Child Matters, grew from her story. And in 2021, Canada made September the 30th a national statutory holiday, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. For many non-Indigenous Canadians, that summer was genuinely shattering. But I keep coming back to how one survivor after another described the moment. The country, they said, wasn't learning something new. It was realizing it hadn't listened. Everything announced in 2021 had been said out loud on the record for decades by survivors, by commissions, by government doctor in 1907. The information itself was never missing. The listening was. Let me just widen the lens, because if you're listening to this outside Canada and feeling comfortably distant, I'm afraid I've got some news. The United States ran its own vast network of Indian boarding schools. Carlisle, remember, was the model that Canada copied, with the same removals, the same haircuts, the same forbidden languages, the same school cemeteries. Only in the 1920s did the US federal government begin a full official accounting of the system, ultimately acknowledging these hundreds of schools, confirming close to 1,000 child deaths in them. With the true toll, I have to say, probably higher, and issuing in 2024 a formal presidential apology. Australia actually removed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children from their families on such a scale and for so long, well into the 1970s, and those taken are known simply as the stolen generations. The landmark Bringing Them Home report laid it out in 1997. A national apology finally came in 2008. In Scandinavia, Sami children were sent to boarding schools designed to strip them of their language and make them Norwegian or Swedish or Finnish. The policy in Norway even had an official name, Norwegianization. Truth commissions are still right now working through that legacy. New Zealand ran a different system, native schools rather than mass removal to boarding institutions. But the assimilationist heart was the same, right down to the children being punished for speaking Maori in the schoolyard. Different flags, different churches, different centuries of contact. And the same idea arrived at independently by colonial governments across the world. We changed the future. Take the children, and the culture dies with their grandparents. And I think that's what makes this story bigger than Canada. It isn't one country's aberration. It's what settler states did when they decided a people were an obstacle. And it's a permanent lesson in how much destruction can be administered politely by school bells and ledger books without a single battle taking place. So I struggled how to end a story like this, and I didn't want it to be with the graves. The graves are part of the truth, and the work around them continues with the patience and care that it demands. But they're not the ending, because there's one more fact, the biggest one, and it's this. The policy failed. 120 years, more than 150,000 children, the full apparatus of a modern state, law, police, church, budget, aimed at one objective, that these peoples should cease to exist as peoples. And it failed. Despite everything, the punishments, the hunger, the loneliness, the abuse, the generations separated from their families, the cultures survived. Battered, yes, wounded, carrying grief that is still being worked through in real time, but very much alive. Today, languages that could get a child's mouth washed out with soap are actually taught in schools, Indigenous run schools, some of them standing on the very lands where the old institutions stood themselves. There are language nests where toddlers learn Cree as their first language, as an example. Canada actually passed an Indigenous Languages Act to help fund this revival. Ceremonies once criminalized are now held in the open. The potlatch, the sundance, the songs, they're back and they're public, and I can happily say that they're growing. And the survivors, peoples once punished for speaking, then told for decades that nobody wanted to hear them, well, they became the most consequential voices of the country. They testified before commissions, they wrote books, they built the memorials, they changed the national calendar, the school curriculum, and the way a country tells its own story. And I think perhaps most importantly of all, they told their grandchildren around kitchen tables in their own returning languages, the stories that cross the generations, which is precisely the transmission the whole system was built to sever. The schools succeeded in causing immense suffering, so let's never minimalize that. The suffering was the system working as designed. But in their ultimate aim, the erasures of people, they didn't succeed. They couldn't succeed, because the plan depended on children forgetting, and the children refused. They whispered under blankets, they sang in barns, they walked towards home along the railway lines. They held on to their real names for 60 years and then wrote them in books. Every Indigenous language spoken in Canada today, every ceremony, every child now growing up fluent in a tongue the state tried to kill. All of it is their monument. Thanks for listening in, folks. I know it's been a bit of a tough podcast, but it's a story that I think has to be told and retold. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Bye for now.